So welcome to PNPI's Researcher Showcase featuring Brittani Williams of the Education Trust. My name is Mary Ellen McGuire and I'm the president of PNPI, and I'm joined today by Betsy Preeter, our Senior Director of Programming. The goal of this and all of our Researcher Showcases is to introduce you to the work of up-and-coming researchers in the federal higher education policy space. I'm going to start today by introducing Brittani, who will then provide us with a quick overview of a recent brief she's worked on, How Black Women Experience Student Debt. Please feel free to submit questions at any time, even while she's presenting, via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Betsy will ask your questions for you during the Q&A after Brittani finishes her presentation. So Brittani, welcome. For those of you who don't know her yet, Brittani is a senior policy analyst at EdTrust on the higher education team. Prior to joining EdTrust, she worked in student support outreach for the state of Louisiana as an education program consultant. Her work included promoting, preparing, and providing support to students for post-secondary success. She holds a master's degree from the Louisiana State University and A&M College in Higher Education Administration, and is currently pursuing her doctorate in Educational Leadership and Policy from Texas Tech University. So Brittani, what can you tell us about how Black women experience student debt?
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen, and I am so excited to be here with you guys today. I will be presenting just some very quick findings around the brief that I co-authored with Victoria Jackson. And I have a quick presentation. But before we get into the brief, I really want to give some background information for those of you who may not be familiar with this body of work. The data for the brief originated from a report that was published last year titled How Black Borrowers Experience Student Loans. This report was done by Dr. Jaleel Bishop and Dr. Jonathan Davis, and basically they employed a survey that's collected around 1,300 respondents and basically looked at several different things. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous. Several different things around how Black borrowers experience student loans. A few of the findings from the report were that student loans were not good debt. And so although student loan debt is widely considered good debt as it offers pathways to credentials, the respondents in our survey felt like it was not good debt. The second finding was that our income-driven repayment plans felt like a lifetime debt sentence because they were not affordable and not easy to keep up in payment. Our third finding was that limiting student debt cancellation would harm Black borrowers the most. And then lastly, about 80% of our survey respondents thought that the federal government should cancel all student loan debt. This original report is on EdTrust's website, as well as the brief that we'll be talking about today. So getting into the brief, our high-level findings were Black women are burdened the most by cost of college. For Black women, more debt does not equal a higher salary. The racial wealth gap leaves Black women with few resources to repay student debt. Many Black women are student parents, and many women are struggling to manage repayment. And so now I'll show you a little bit of our data. So Black women are burdened the most by a high cost of college. What you see on your screen here is a graph that illustrates undergraduate and graduate federal borrowing amounts. This includes principal and interest. And so you can see here on your screen that Black American females borrow higher amounts in undergraduate and graduate programs. For Black women, more debt does not equal a higher salary. Black women must attain a bachelor's degree or higher to earn more than white men who have some college but no degree. And what you see on your screen here across race and sex are earnings for high school graduates, some college degree, some college but earn no degree, an associate's degree or bachelor's degree or higher. The racial wealth gap leaves Black women with few resources to repay student debt. And so shown here by race and sex are borrowers who received help from their family or friends in the past 12 months prior to the survey to pay for student loans. And again, here you can see of the information displayed that Black American females receive the least amount of assistance in repayment. Black women are struggling to manage repayment. And so here what you see is a ratio of amount owed to amount borrowed for federal student loans 12 years after starting college. And I just want to note that this data, the original data for this information, was collected in 2004. Mary Ellen, that was very quickly some of the findings from our brief, and I will now turn it over for question and answer.
Thank you, Brittany. I'm going to pass it over to Betsy, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. That was some great data.
Thank you. Thanks, Brittany, and hello, everybody. Looking forward to continuing this conversation. Great job, Brittany. As a reminder, you can put questions in the Q&A box, and I will happily ask them on your behalf. You can also upvote questions that you also want to know the answer to, as you can view any questions that's been submitted. But I have a question that maybe we can start with, Brittany, and that's about how you mentioned that in the report, in the brief, you mentioned that Black women are more likely to be student parents. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why that's important to note, especially for policymakers.
Thank you for that question. I think that it was important for us to include student parents because in the conversation, oftentimes we don't highlight or recognize that borrowers also have other responsibilities. And particularly for the respondents from our survey that identified as having other dependents or, specifically having children to care for, this also affects how repayment happens for Black women particularly.
Thank you. Okay, I have other questions, but we have some from the audience, so I will get to those. Did the original study sample include graduate student borrowers is a question. And depending, what do we know about graduate student borrowers, if anything, in this context?
Yes, and so the original sample, the original survey did include graduate borrowers, and we did have quite a few respondents that shared loan amounts. And so if it's okay, Betsy, I could share the PowerPoint with the attendees today, but we have that data that I mentioned, and it spelled out, the undergraduate borrowing amounts as well as the graduate borrower amounts.
Thank you. All right, another question from the audience, and I promise I will get to the one that's upvoted. I'm just going to save that for last. For anyone watching, I'm not ignoring. Okay, can you talk a little bit more about why just looking at the wage gap is insufficient in examining the impacts of student debt? With an added comment, go Brittany. But anyways, can you sort of unpack that a little bit? Why is looking at the wage gap insufficient?
Thank you so much for that. And I think that when we initially look at, and I won't quote, the source is escaping me right now, but when we look at the definition of what the racial wealth gap is, or the wage gap is, it does not take into account student loan payments. And so I think in order to adequately address what the wage gap truly is across different races, I think that we have to include that information as well. And so including, the total amount owed and things like that to get a better picture.
Thank you. Another question, how might we reframe the conversation of value and return on investment for Black women, specifically Black women with advanced degrees?
That's a good question. Give me a second to think about
How
that.
might we reframe the conversation of the value and ROI for Black women with advanced degrees?
Reframing return on advancement with the advanced degrees. I think that, excuse me, and I'm speaking, just from the brief and from the data that collected. So this answer is based on the sample, not the entire population. But I think that from what a lot of our borrowers shared, they pursued those advanced degrees because I think the notion is advanced degrees will equal higher wages. I think that it was upon completing those degrees and then realizing how high, payments would be and things like that. I think that is where that realization sets in. And so in terms of reframing the thought process, I think it's a case-by-case basis, because across the board with our respondents, they felt that pursuing that graduate degree would get them the, better paying jobs or that next level position. And so it really is, I think an assessment to be done with the beholder of that, pursuing that degree. Is hard to answer for the total when truly that is, one of the common notions that it would be a vehicle for upward economic mobility.
Yeah, great. All right, another question. Somebody would love to hear you talk more about the wealth gap and how it impacts Black women in particular, and perhaps share any reflections you had about the findings from your report.
Okay, I will absolutely start with my reflection here. I think going through the report and just realizing the data, I think that it was super important to highlight Black women in this conversation. And if you've heard me speak before, I often, refer to this brief as continuing the conversation, and highlighting those important pieces. And I think that oftentimes when we look at experiences of Black borrowers, in the total, I think it's important to separate, the Black women experience, because as our data has shown, we experience holding student debt so differently from others. And so that was just one of my biggest reflections. And being a Black woman myself, it really just, honed in on my own experiences. And I'm sorry, Betsy, can you repeat the first question?
No, yes, just, is there anything else you can add to the wealth gap and how that impacts Black women in particular?
Yes, so I think that even if we can go back to the data, and so I'm, just bringing it back to the data that was shared. And so particularly for our respondents in this survey. And so I'll speak to the racial wealth gap with those respondents in mind. So the reason that we felt it was important to highlight this as a finding was really solely because of the repayment in student debt. And again, I just want to go back to the original, or the common definition of the wealth gap does not take into account what resources may be available for particularly Black women, or what resources are not available. And so even if you think of how wages are distributed amongst different things, also too, going back to one of the findings in the report, even with the support of paying back, within the last 12 months from that survey, Black women was the lowest population to even receive help. And so how does that, I think that it's a broader conversation of how do we think about what the racial wage gap is, and how do we capture a total picture. I think that 30 minutes wouldn't allow us to kind of spell out what all should be, captured in that conversation. But, if you wanted to hold space for further, thought partnership around that, we definitely could hold further space. But I think that, just to drive home that main point, I think that there are so many other things that truly should be included in what that definition or that calculation of the racial wage gap is.
Thank you. We have two questions that are very similar. So can you talk a little bit more about some factors and reasons why Black women take out more student loans and hold more student debt? Why are they borrowing more?
And you can actually capture, so when you guys go to the brief, and you can even see this in the report mentioned as well, we captured some qualitative data. And so I've shared, a lot of the quant data from the survey, but the qualitative data really showed the people behind the numbers, and some of the quotes that we gave, just kind of go into why these Black women, these respondents in particular, took out, such a higher amount. And so I'll give a few examples in short, because the quotes are there for you, but we've had a respondent say that that was the only way that they could afford a college degree. So, top line, affordability. Some of these Black women came from low wealth backgrounds, and they saw the student loans as the only way to be able to pursue that degree program. Another respondent talked about having children, and so, just being a student parent. And again, for affordability purposes, the respondents saw that there were no other options. And so that just really, so there are a few other quotes that kind of go deeper into it, but it boils down to affordability and options available, or options that were perceived to be readily available.
Thank you. And you may have seen a link to Brittany's report when you registered, but we are also, we just popped it into the chat as well. It's worth digging into in a little more detail. Brittany, can I ask, we know that in general, women hold more debt than men, federal student loan debt, but what sort of brought you or sort of inspired you to really dig into how Black women are experiencing debt? Was it that data point? Was there something that prompted you that there was more of a story to uncover here? Sort of what was that moment?
I think it was recognized in the original report with Dr. Bishop and Dr. Davis, and this is something that they shared, in data collection, that there were a lot of Black women respondents. And so it just really, the data was there for us to capture readily across, almost 1,300 respondents.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. All right, we have about 5 more minutes before we start to wrap up. So please feel free to continue to submit your questions, and we'll get through as many as we can. I do want to get into sort of some of the recommendations the report makes, and in general, what is EdTrust recommending in terms of how to close that debt gap? First, let's start with that. Sort of, what are some ways we can look at closing the gap for Black women based on the findings from your report?
Yes, so we had a few, and I think I mentioned early on that over 80% of our participants in the study, they thought that all student debt should be canceled, but EdTrust supports canceling up to $50,000. That was one of our recommendations. The next would be significant improvements to the income-driven repayment plans. And so improvements that look like better affordability, and shorter time to forgiveness with those plans. Also, and just acknowledging that it is Pell's 50 year, and so right on time with celebrating 50 years of Pell, EdTrust supports doubling the Pell grant, as well as initiating federal state partnerships for debt-free public college programs.
Thank you. And there's more details on those recommendations in your report if folks are interested. So for that, from the federal level, thank you for addressing that. We had questions about institutions. Do you have thoughts around how institutions could potentially be supporting Black women borrowers better?
So our report did not specifically drill down to the institution level, but I would say one recommendation is around affordability. And so I think that with the institutions being hosted by states, I think that's a conversation for maybe, state and institution. It gets a little bit sticky there, but support, based on our brief that we wrote, looks like affordability. And so thinking through options of affordability and making degree programs more affordable for students would be a highlight.
Is there something that you really want to make sure folks listening remember about this research or about this brief? What is one or two things that you feel are the most important that if they leave here, they're able to talk about these two things in their with coworkers and their, in policy conversations? What would you want folks to leave with?
I think the first thing would be to continue the conversation around how Black borrowers experience debt. I think that this piece, the brief and the report, really highlights an often unspoken about experience in student loan debt. And so just highlighting that piece that this is a really important topic, especially now. This is a highly talked about topic around ed policy. And so that would be the first thing. And then the second thing would be to continue to push for those recommendations. And so how can we activate the resources that we all have collectively to continue to push for the recommendations.
Thank you. So what more research do you think needs to be done? What gap, if you had unlimited time and unlimited budget and all of this, sort of what do you think is sort of ripe for new research, or what kind of data would you really like to have that you don't currently have access to?
I think if it was up to me with unlimited time, I would like to unpack student loan borrowing before degree completion. I would love to unpack those experiences. And so how, again, this kind of ties into, one of our recommendations, but often, that missing component around maybe federal and state partnerships for debt-free public college. And so maybe looking at, some states that have programs around debt-free college experiences and how that ties into, what the total debt looks like there. But with unlimited time, of course. maybe down the road.
Down the road. And speaking of down the road, sort of what is the next step in this project? Are there more briefs coming? What might we expect to see soon?
Yes, we actually do have more briefs coming. And so you can head over to EdTrust website and sign up to be notified for when the next pieces come out. And so the next piece to be released would be how mental health and the Black borrower experience go hand in hand. And we're unpacking more data from that original study. And then there will be more pieces from there. And so definitely sign up, go to EdTrust website and stay a part of the conversation.
Thank you. We're headed into our last few minutes. So I did want to thank Brittani for participating today, for sharing her work and her brief. And also really appreciate all of you asking your questions. I'm going to launch a really quick poll. Would love to hear feedback about what you learned, what you thought of the event. For those of you who have been to PNPI events before, we really value feedback and suggestions, and we're always looking to continuously improve. These showcases are a way to highlight some really important work being done in a small amount of time, but we really hope your learning doesn't stop with this 30 minutes, that you read the brief and continue to dig into the work that's being done. So wanted to thank Brittani for joining us, and we hope to see all of you again at another upcoming event. But please do take the poll before you sign off. And thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Brittany.
Thank you.